Thank you to all of you who are viewing this webinar live on the Bright Chalk channel, and also to you who are viewing it on demand. I sincerely appreciate your interest in this topic, a topic that has challenged salespeople for generations. As I've spoken to salespeople and sales executives around the world, I've learned from many of them, as well as from the client executives we interviewed in several major studies we conducted. Many of the salespeople shared with me the techniques they have used to survive the executive screening process. Hello again, and now let me introduce myself. I'm Steve Bistritz, founder and president of SellExcel.com and author of the best-selling sales book, Selling to the C-Suite. Just a little about me. I spent 28 years with IBM as a salesperson, sales manager, and in numerous other positions with IBM, including manager of a sales training development organization for a billion-dollar division. Then I became vice president of product development for a small sales training company in Atlanta before starting my own sales training and consulting company in 2002. My major focus today is on delivering one-day workshops to salespeople on selling to the C-suite and providing one-on-one coaching to B2B salespeople. Before we talk about surviving the executive screening process, you should spend some time at the beginning of the sales cycle to identify what I call the relevant executive for the sales opportunity you're pursuing. Think about that for a minute, and let me ask you a question. Can you identify the relevant executive for the sales opportunity you're currently pursuing? Or more importantly, can you identify the relevant executive for the last sales opportunity you lost? You're probably sitting there thinking, just how does Steve define the relevant executive? And actually, it's quite simple. So here it is. The relevant executive is the executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as a result of the outcome of the project or application that's associated with your sales opportunity. Think about that for a minute. The executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as a result of the outcome of the project or application associated with your sales opportunity. I felt so strongly about that concept that I devoted an entire chapter around it to the second edition of my book, Selling to the C-Suite. And that reminds me, many of the slides you'll see today come from my one-day Sell Excel workshop, and you'll also see a number of them in my book. I'm going to position this webinar around the pursuit of your sales opportunity and asking you to sit on the other side of the desk and view your opportunity from the client's perspective. And it should be obvious why you should do that, but unfortunately, even many experienced salespeople don't view their sales opportunity from the client's perspective. So let's get started. And what I'm going to do today is leave you with some ideas about how you could survive that executive screening process. I'm going to give you some examples of what to do, and I'll remind you again at the end of those examples and some of the things I've talked about during this session. Now, number one, let's talk about what I expect to be the overall outcomes of today's webinar. First of all, we're going to talk about the executive screening process. What happens and how do executives test salespeople? How should you approach executives so as to circumvent some of those roadblocks using techniques that we'll talk about, and I'll have a handout of 20 ways of circumventing roadblocks. Then I'm going to have you become perceived as a credible resource to those executives based on your understanding of those key business objectives. That's going to position you better in the executive's eyes so that ultimately you can become perceived as the trusted advisor, because that should be your ultimate objective, to become perceived as that trusted advisor. And I know that term is bandied around a lot, but I'm telling you that I can remember those client executives who viewed me as a trusted advisor. And there's probably 40 or 50 or 60 of them over the times that I've been selling. It doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen in every client organization. But when you find them, they're gems, okay? And they will help you. When you become the trusted advisor of an executive, that executive becomes your mentor, not a champion or a coach who's cheering you on from the sidelines. But I view a mentor as someone who's selling in your absence. When you're not there, when you're not at the client organization, they will stand up and say that your solution is the best solution for this organization, and perhaps even for them personally. Now, before we begin today's discussion, or I'm actually going to begin by describing some of the studies we conducted with CXO-level executives, and we asked those executives about their relationships with professional salespeople. In the initial study, I had a team of MBA students from the University of North Carolina help me, and those students were actually salespeople themselves who had at least 5 years of sales experience, and they were studying for their MBAs at UNC. Here are the areas we focused on. When and why did executives get involved in the decision process for major purchases? Secondly, what has to happen in a meeting with salespeople for the executive to view it as an effective meeting? Third, how do salespeople establish trust and credibility with executives so that they can get that return access? And lastly, what were executives looking for in strategic relationships with suppliers? And throughout today's webinar, I'm going to talk about some of the results of those questions. And I'm actually going to start right now with that first question. When and why do senior executives get involved in the decision process for major purchases? And you can see we identified some steps in the buying cycle, as you can see here on this graph. And we asked those executives, when did you get involved in that decision process? And here's what they told us, some surprises here. Number one, they said they got involved early to help set the strategy for the project, to help identify some of the project's objectives. But they also said they got involved late to help plan the implementation and measure the results. But they said during this middle process here, where you see the purple graphs, they said we tended to delegate down some of those steps, like setting vendor criteria and examining alternatives. And where does your sales cycle start? Well, for many salespeople, it starts right here. The middle, right there, is your sales cycle. That's typically also where you might be the recipient of an RFP. And you know, I was talking to an executive at a major company yesterday, just yesterday, a company whose name you would recognize. And he said to me, Steve, he said, if we get an RFP, we don't respond to it. Why? Because somebody else probably wrote it, helped the executive write it. And they're exactly right, okay? That's why you need to get involved early with that senior executive. They want to see you then. They're trying to set the objectives for the project. Help them outline what those project objectives should be and get your product's specifications outlined in that RFP, if you will. Now, that study was conducted a number of years back. What's happening today? What are today's C-suite buyers doing? Well, they're leveraging the internet. They're conducting their own research. They're getting involved much earlier. They want immediate value. They know more about you and your company than you probably know about them. Now, what are the implications for sales professionals of that early involvement in the buying cycle? Okay? Well, number one, you've got to be involved with social media. Social networking makes it much easier to help you build those relationships with C-suite executives. And the bottom line is your competitors are doing that today. Now, here's what executives told us. And this is a study that was done just 4 years ago. 63% of C-suite buyers use LinkedIn to support their purchase process. 63%, and that's 4 years ago. It has to be more than that today. So what are the implications of that? Well, one of the implications is you better have a LinkedIn profile that identifies you and how you can deliver value to those C-suite executives. Because guess what? They're looking you up on LinkedIn just as you're looking them up. So here's what I say, okay? And here's an example. And I know this is probably pretty difficult to read, okay? But you'll be able to get a PDF of this presentation. And this is my summary. These are the first 3 paragraphs in my LinkedIn profile. And what it shows to the executive, it shows the executive my value that I'm trying to deliver to them. What am I trying to do for them? And how can I help them? So they see that right away. And when we started to interview CXO-level executives about their relationships with professional salespeople, I went with an MBA student who conducted some of those interviews. And in one of the first practice interviews she conducted, we met with the CIO of a Fortune 500 company, again, whose name you would recognize. And after the MBA student asked all the questions we had prepared, I turned to the CIO and I said, now, Jim, why would an executive at your level ever want to meet with a professional salesperson? And his answer totally surprised me, and I never forgot it. And here's what he said, okay? And this is in my book. I meet with professional salespeople because often they can offer me solutions that even people within my own organization can't develop. They've seen these problems in other companies, and I want the benefit of that experience. Now, what does this tell you? What does this tell you? This tells you that executives are looking at salespeople to deliver value, to create and deliver value for them. They're not so much concerned as with your rank, okay? They're not concerned about your rank in the organization. Can you deliver value to them? And if you can, they want to meet with you. So let's go back again for a minute and talk about that definition of the relevant executive, because that's the executive we need to align with in the client organization. And here it is. I said it before. I'll say it again. The executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as it relates to the outcome of the project or application that's associated with your sales opportunity. So you may be going in there selling a product or a service, but you need to first identify the need and requirement of that client. You need to listen to them tell you what their needs are specifically before you propose any solution. But more importantly, this executive, the relevant executive, possesses a level of informal power as it relates to the buying decision. And you know, when you're going after this executive in the client organization, trying to identify him or her, it's going to help you get around those roadblocks. Because if you're calling on the right person, they want to talk to you. Why do they want to talk to you? Because of what I said before. Because often you can help them with solutions that even people within their own organization can't develop. Now let's take a look at a typical organization chart and pretend we're trying to sell an IT solution into this organization. And in the chart you're going to see right here, you're going to see 3 silos in this organization. You're going to see an operations silo on the left, an IT silo in the middle, and a finance silo on the right-hand side, okay? And those are headed up by the COO, the CIO, and the CFO. Now, if we're selling a customer service solution, IT-based customer service solution into this organization, we'd probably typically be calling on this person right here. the Information Technology Director, good old Harvey Long here, on the lower part of this organization chart. Now, if I said to you, who has the formal power for the IT-based customer service solution, most of you would probably say it lies right here. And you'd be exactly right, in the IT silo. That's where the formal power lies. Now, as I said, where does the informal power for this same decision lie? Okay, you can't answer that question. You can't determine that from the organization chart. And that's the other key thing I want to tell you today. You can't look at an organization chart and identify the informal power. It might be coming from anywhere, okay? In this particular case, the informal power lies here with the customer service director and the COO. And if I asked you who the relevant executive is, again, you can't tell that from the organization chart. But I happen to know in this particular case that this person right here, okay, the COO, is the relevant executive for this opportunity. And the reason for that is his neck is on the line to improve customer service. The IT solution will help him do that, but he has the responsibility for getting that done. So he happens to be the relevant executive for this opportunity. His neck is on the line for this particular opportunity. Okay? In all cases, we're looking at opportunities. We're not looking at account situations. We're looking at opportunities. So now we see the challenge. Here we are calling on Harvey Long, okay? He's in a different silo at a lower level. So we've got to get to the operations silo, and we've got to get to a higher level. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we get to the COO so that we can share our solution value with him? Now, I want to take you back for a minute, okay, because Lou Gerstner found this out right away when he came into the IBM company as CEO in 1993. And I was working at IBM in 1993 when Lou Gerstner came in. And he really rattled the chains of the organization. First time an outsider had come into the IBM company at an executive level, at any executive level, and here he came to be the CEO of IBM. And what he found out was that IBM salespeople had been totally focused on the CIO silo. They hadn't been getting to the functional executives of the client organizations, and they had not been establishing strong relationships at those levels. And I'm talking about COO, CFO, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Marketing Officer perhaps, Chief Medical Officer if it was a healthcare organization, things of that nature. So Lou really changed things around at IBM and made his executives and the teams below them start to focus on functional relationships with other organizations outside of the CIO silo. Now, to give you an example of formal and informal power to really drive this home, I'm going to give you another example that everyone here should be familiar with. And it goes back to George W. Bush's first term when Colin Powell was Secretary of State. Okay? Now, as Secretary of State, he had the formal power for affairs of state and things that were happening in the State Department, okay? But the question is, he did have the formal power, but who had the informal power at that time? And if I ask that question, I get a lot of answers like, well, maybe Dick Cheney, maybe Don Rumsfeld, maybe other people. But the answer to that question in terms of who had the informal power was Condoleezza Rice, right? She was the National Security Advisor at the time, not even a cabinet-level position, but she had the president's ear. She literally talked to him every day. She worked out with him, talked sports with him, had dinner at the White House with George and Laura, and even accompanied the family on trips to Camp David on weekends. So she really had the ear of the president, and she wielded a big power within the organization, even though she was the national security advisor and Colin Powell was the Secretary of State. And actually, if you remember what happened in the second George W. Bush term, she actually became the Secretary of State, took Colin Powell's place when he resigned. So I just want to show you one other thing about this cover. This happens to be prophetic. You probably can't see it from where you are, but the date on the cover is September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11. So you're dealing with lots of executives in the client organization. How do you determine the irrelevant executives from the relevant executives? And here I'm going to tell you a story, a quick story, that happened in a workshop I was delivering to a healthcare organization. And in the middle of the workshop, one of the account executives from the client organization stood up and said, "Steve, I have a story for you. And let me tell you what happened to me." He said that he'd been calling on the medical technology director of a very large company, was headquartered in the Midwest. He continually pursued that an executive in terms of attempting to sell his solution without a lot of success. He then arranged for a meeting with the director and his boss, the chief medical officer, the CMO, and he arranged the meeting by announcing to the technology director that his regional manager was coming to town and wanted to meet a senior executive at that organization. So the regional manager and the salesperson both flew into town for the meeting with the technology director and the CMO. And it happened that the company was located in the Midwest, and there was a snowstorm that day, and the technology director wasn't able to make his way to the office. But the CMO was able to make it and said that he'd still have the meeting because the two people from the sales organization had flown into town, braved the snowstorm, and made it to the company location. And during the meeting, the salesperson introduced his regional manager, reviewed his value proposition, and then discussed his solution. And the CMO said, "Well, what do we have to do to move forward?" And the salesperson then found out at that point, right then, that he was now dealing with the relevant executive, the CMO. And the medical technology director, with whom he had the prolonged relationship, was actually the irrelevant executive. Most importantly, the salesperson now had access to the relevant executive, the CMO, and could contact that executive at any time to further the relationship and pursue other opportunities. The key is the last bullet point on this slide. Irrelevant executives will never tell you that they're irrelevant. And sometimes you have to find out the hard way. You can be calling on people for many, many years sometimes and find out they're not really the people making the decisions. It's somebody else in the client organization. So you may have to jeopardize a lower level relationship to get to a senior executive, because if you don't, your competitors will, and you'll lose the deal. So let's talk about the different ways of gaining access to executives in client organizations, and you know all these. Internal sponsor, somebody within the client organization helps you get a meeting with a senior executive. An external referral, someone outside the organization, could be a business partner, could be a consultant, could be a friend of the executive, helps you get a meeting. And the last point on this slide is gatekeeper. And what I say to salespeople is treat the gatekeeper as a resource. And I even take it to one more step. I say treat the gatekeeper as if he or she was the executive himself or herself, because often they can help you. They know what's on the executive's mind. So let's talk about, preparing your approach so you have an effective approach to get to an executive, okay? And here's an outline. Here's a template for a 3 to 5 minute telephone call on the executive to get a meeting. Now, you may reach the executive, you may reach the executive's assistant, you may reach a secretary, or you may get voicemail. Any one of those four can happen, okay? But in that 3 to 5 minute message or less that you want to leave, if you have to leave it on voicemail, you want to cover these four areas. Who are you? What's the purpose of your call? Some credibility, and then what do you want that executive to do? In the credibility area, this is key. You need to do some homework so you can provide them with a sense of the value you can deliver to them. That's so important. So you've got to be prepared to make that call, and again, you may get voicemail when you try to reach the executive, okay? So a couple of suggestions here I have for you in doing this approach. Number one, you've got to put yourself in the position of the executive as you develop your approach. Think about what it's like to be on the other side of that desk listening to you deliver your message. And here's a way to do that. Develop your message and then record it on your voice message system. And then listen to the message and ask yourself, would you respond to a message like the one you just heard? Then go about improving it to make it more credible, more compelling, more concise, right? So let's look at what happens. Roadblocks get put in place, okay? Why are there roadblocks in place, and how do you get around them? That's really what the focus of this session is all about, okay? So why are there roadblocks in place? Well, here's what your peers told us. You know, executives like to delegate some of these types of meetings. Could be it's the formal process. It's the way this client works. When I was working for IBM, you didn't get a meeting on any executive's calendar without going to his or her executive assistant. Perhaps these executives have had bad experiences with salespeople. They're too busy. Maybe they have already selected a vendor and they're already aligned with a competitor for this application or project. So those are just some of the reasons why the executives put roadblocks in place. Again, sometimes just to test salespeople. All right? Now, how did your peers tell us, how did they get around some of these roadblocks? Well, here again is what your peers told us, okay? And there's a lot of things on this chart, all right? I talked about one just before. Organize an equivalent rank meeting or bring your boss or manager into town and say, hey, he or she would like to meet with a senior executive at that particular organization. Use business partners that you've worked with. Help leverage the network of a client executive. Focus on your past value contribution. I'm not going to read through all these. You can see what they are, but there are ways to circumvent the roadblocks. There are ways to get around them. But you're being prepared with a value message can help you circumvent that roadblock. You may convince the gatekeeper that you have something that executive really needs to hear. And again, you only do that through thorough preparation and knowing who you're calling on in the client organization and what they're looking for. Now, so one of the things that you're going to be able to get as a result of this session today is a handout, 20 ways of circumventing roadblocks. So make sure you download it from your panel here when we're finished with today's session, okay? Now, let me move ahead and talk about some of those other areas that we asked executives about when we were asking them about their relationships with professional salespeople. One of the questions we asked executives was, when you form partnerships with strategic suppliers, what benefits did you expect and what did you actually get? And you can see in blue is what they expected, and what they got is in red, okay? Maybe a little bit difficult to read on this screen, okay? But there's what we call that loyalty gap there. There's that difference, and you have to somehow skirt that difference. I'm going to talk a little bit now next about credibility and the components of credibility. How do you get credibility with an executive? And again, another way to help you get around that roadblock, okay? Credibility is actually shaped by two components. Number one, capability, where you can start proving yourself. You're an extra pair of hands. You're an expert for hire within this organization. But also, you can also demonstrate integrity. Okay, become reliable and trustworthy. So trust is another component. But if you operate on both planes, that's when you truly operate in what I call the client value zone. And here's where you can become perceived as that trusted advisor. And when you become perceived as the trusted advisor, often the relationship can become collaborative. And what do I mean by collaborative? What I mean there is that the executive looks for ways to help you. And again, here's another way of getting around roadblocks. Executives who view you as a trusted advisor will help you get meetings with other people in the client organization. So develop that relationship. Make it collaborative so that they look for ways to help you. And here's another book you should be reading. It's called The Trusted Advisor by David Meister. It's kind of an old standard, all right? But in it, he talks about his view of a trusted advisor as someone who maintains and preserves the relationship, not only on the current outcome, but the overall relationship. So not looking at what's happening with this one transaction, but how is the overall relationship progressing? Are you helping that client within your organization? Okay? Are you elevating what their needs and requirements are within your own organization? Now, here's an activity I use in my one-day workshop, and here's where I ask salespeople to tell me if they are a true trusted advisor of a client executive. And I'll often, if I'm doing a workshop, ask salespeople to give me a show of hands of how many people here think they have a trusted advisor level relationship with an executive or have had one. And a lot of people will raise their hand. And then I'll ask them the key question: what has the executive done to demonstrate that they perceive you as a trusted advisor? Because it just doesn't happen. They have to do something to you to demonstrate that you're a trusted advisor. And when I ask that question, here's what they tell us. Lots of different things. And if one of your customer executives is doing some or more of these things for you or to you, then you have that trusted advisor relationship. Are they sharing confidential information with you? Are they showing you their long-range plans? Are they asking you to come off-site, perhaps, and share with them some of the things that are happening within their organization? Here's one I heard a couple of weeks ago from another session where one of the salespeople told me, my executive said no to a better deal or a lower cost from a competitor. Now, what's that mean? That means that the customer executive sees your value and is willing to pay more for your value than a competitor, even though the competitor may have a solution at a lower price. Because of what? That credibility you have with them, that trust and capability. They know you can do the job, and they trust you to get it done, okay? So that's what executives are looking for. And when you become that trusted advisor, well, a lot of good things happen. And I'm going to give you a couple of different examples, okay? Myself, personal examples, becoming a trusted advisor. As a professional salesperson, I was selling solutions into a large manufacturing company. This is a long time ago, right? But I remember it, as if it happened yesterday. I was calling on the CFO of this company, selling them incremental solutions, And I had met the CEO on a number of different occasions because we always, on a yearly basis, communicated the value that we were delivering to this company. And the CEO met me in the hall and he said, Steve, he said, I'd like you to go down to our manufacturing plant floor, take a look at it, and see if you've got a better solution for us down there. Now, if that happens, if an executive sends you down to a lower level executive, what should you do? Two things. Most people automatically say, well, yeah, you want to come back and deliver to them the message that you came up with or the results that you came up with, the results that you want to share with that executive at some later point in time, but also get that CEO or that higher level executive to introduce you to the lower level person. What does it show the lower level person? The importance of the meeting. And he did that for me, and we were able to sell a mainframe to this company to run their manufacturing plant because the company had an objective of outstripping their competitors. They wanted to become number one in the marketplace, and they saw this solution as a way to do it. And they implemented it and actually rose quickly from number 3 to number 2. Don't know if they ever got to number 1, but they sure jumped ahead of a lot of other competitors as they moved up the chain. The second example is I was selling sales training solutions, and I was selling them to a global professional services organization. And my boss, the CEO of the company, really didn't want to do business with this professional services company because they wanted to modify one of our sales training programs. And he said, I really don't want to do that. But I told my CEO, I think I have a way to modify our training solution so that we can really meet the needs of this global services manufacturer. But in the process, I said to the client executive, we will make changes to our solution as long as it doesn't compromise the integrity of the program, because we know the program works and we can't compromise its integrity. If I'm willing to make minor changes and align them with your company, but we can't make major changes that would impact the integrity of the program. And we won the deal. $2 million deal. This is, again, many years ago, but it was before I started my own company. And I said to the client executive a little bit later, I said, Norm, what made the decision for you? Why did you pick us? We're amongst 6 different competitors. And he said, because of what you said. A lot of other companies told us, we'll make any changes you want. They just wanted to get our business. They didn't care, and they didn't care about compromising their solution. But you were so convinced that your solution was good and it would fit our company, and you were willing to make some of those major modifications, and that's why we went with you. The last example is in my current company, selling sales training companies to a global healthcare company. I was working with the senior vice president or global vice president of marketing, and he was able to get me into the organization by focusing on that concept of the relevant executive. And he had been developing value propositions for the technical buyer, and he turned that around and changed it into selling those solutions toward the relevant executive. And we, as a result, started training their salespeople on how to sell to C-suite executives using that concept of the relevant executive. Okay, let me go forward and talk about, when you're talking to different people in the client organization, you're talking at different levels. You've got to be speaking different languages at different levels of the organization, because operations folks, they're interested in price and discounts, right? You'll get beaten up on price. They always want the best price. That's how they're measured. That's how they're motivated. Trying to focus on value with an operations level person probably won't work. Management people, they're looking at how your solution will fit into the organization. But when you're dealing at the executive level, they're looking at other uses of funds. They're truly looking at the value of your solution, because they have a company-wide view of what's happening. People at the management level, they have a department or function view of what's happening, and people at that lower level operations area, they have a very myopic project view. They're simply looking at the project that they're working on. And again, value doesn't mean a lot. You just need to know this when you're talking at different levels of the organization. Having done your homework in preparation for your meeting with the client executive, your next step is to prepare a set of what I call provocative questions that challenge the executive and demonstrate to them that you've done some homework on their organization. And here's some examples of provocative questions you might be asking. How would your customers describe the experience of doing business with your company? You can't get that from the internet. You have to ask and find out how their customers describe doing business with them. Given the fierce competitive situation, what will the survivors have done to endure 5 years from now? Last provocative question, what will happen if you decide to delay the implementation of this initiative? Who will be affected? What will be affected? Is any of this initiative mission critical? Those are things you need to ask or can ask and show that executive you've done some homework on them. So again, there's 2 handouts that you can access. Here they are. You can just download them. One is the 20 ways of circumventing roadblocks, and the second handout is my guide to client discovery that will help you really look at clients from 3 levels of learning: the client's industry, the client's company, and the client executive himself or herself. Okay, so remember, each interaction you have with an executive will either dilute or enhance your credibility. So you're either moving the needle up or you're moving it down. So you need to think about that as you have interactions with executives. So let me summarize some of the things we talked about today and some of the things you need to be doing to survive this executive screening process. The first one is the simplest one you can do right now. As soon as you listen to this message today, as soon as you finish this webinar, you can go out and go modify your LinkedIn profile. Make it so that it looks like you're delivering value to them. It looks like it because you are. So you've got to be able to articulate to that executive the value they can expect to achieve. Because, again, they're looking you up just as you're looking them up. They know more about you before you even start talking to them. So they'll know about your background, where you've been, the number of companies you've worked for. And, again, you want to make sure your message is one of value. Secondly, again, identifying that relevant executive. More importantly, aligning with that relevant executive is so important so that you're focusing on the executive who can help you win the deal. All right? You want to get that executive, you want to get that relevant executive to be your mentor. That should be your objective. Number 3, do your homework on the client organization so that you can provide a glimpse of the value you can deliver, even in the initial phone call to the executive. Make sure you have some idea of the value you can deliver to them. 4th, look at creative ways to circumvent those roadblocks. Take that document, the 20 ways of circumventing roadblocks. They all won't apply, but you'll be able to find some that you can use and implement in your sales organization and your sales calls that you're making on client executives. 5th, develop a set of those provocative questions that you can ask the executive in a critical face-to-face call, showing the executive you've done some homework. Lastly, make certain you listen to the executive before you propose a solution. They want you to hear them. Executives buy not when they understand, but when they feel they are understood. So listen first and then propose your solution. Okay, I'm going to end with that and ask if you have any questions. I will answer them. I haven't seen any questions come up yet. One person asked if your manager is not ready to have you take the time to develop the relationship, they're impatient, they want results now, how do you develop those relationships? Well, salespeople are managers of their own time, okay? That's the only thing they have to really, sell, if you will, is all their time. So you've got to manage your time the best you see it. And if it takes you time to develop those relationships, well, so be it. And I think, results will come when you develop those relationships. And again, those relevant executives can become your mentor. And when they become your mentor, they're selling in your absence. And that's the point you want to get them. Okay? All right. Anything else? Anybody else have any questions? No questions asked. This is a quiet group today. Okay. Any other thoughts? Oh, somebody just asked, tell me more about, how do you identify the relevant executive? What kind of steps can you take to identify the relevant executive? What should you be looking for? Well, you want to see which executive initiated the project or application. Look who's on the evaluation committee. See if somebody there is someone who can help you. Look at how these buying decisions were made in the past. Talk to some of the lower level executives and see if you can get some input from those executives. Talk to other salespeople in your company. Look for reorganizations that are happening. Look at which executives are tapped to lead the high visibility or special assignments, special projects. Look at who's connected to who in the client organization. That can often lead you to someone who is delivering value. Okay, any other questions? Okay, they're telling me I'm overrunning and it's going to shut off in about less than a minute. So I'll look for other questions. I don't see any. Okay. Thank you very much for attending today, and I wish you all the best in your sales ventures. Find those relevant executives and have them become your mentors. Thanks so much. I'm at sellexcel.com if you have any other questions later on. Thank you so much.